You're not here by accident. There is a secret beneath the solitude, a secret that many women carry in silence, not because they chose solitude, but because life, slowly, repeatedly, carved this path for them. You may have said the words, yourself, "I prefer being alone," and yet, beneath that phrase lives a silent grief. The grief of not having been emotionally received, the grief of failed attempts at intimacy, the grief of always holding the emotional weight for others. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the psyche's brilliant attempt to survive what felt unbearable. Carl Jung teaches us that what we repress does not disappear. It lives within us as shadow. And today, together, we will gently illuminate that shadow. We will honor the hidden grief beneath chosen solitude. Because you are not falling apart, you are falling into place. For many women who live alone without a man, solitude is often not the result of pure self-empowerment, but rather the culmination of years, sometimes decades, of invisible relational wounds. These wounds are rarely dramatic or easily named. They are often composed of thousands of small emotional betrayals, not being prioritized, not being emotionally seen, not feeling safe to express needs. The woman may say, "I prefer being alone," but beneath this autonomy lives an unspoken grief, the grief of not having been emotionally received, the grief of failed attempts at intimacy, the grief of being the one who always holds the emotional weight of relationships. Trauma as adaptation, not choice. Carl Jung teaches that the psyche adapts to protect itself from unbearable pain. When repeated relational trauma accumulates, solitude becomes an adaptive defense, an unconscious way to avoid further emotional injury. The nervous system, shaped by the neurobiology of attachment, begins to associate closeness with threat. Emotional intimacy becomes coded as dangerous, not safe. This creates what modern trauma theorists recognize as attachment-based trauma combined with autonomic nervous system dysregulation. The unconscious contract, it's safer to not need. The woman who lives alone may carry an unconscious contract, deeply rooted in childhood. If I need nothing, I cannot be disappointed. If I stay distant, I cannot be abandoned. If I carry it all myself, I remain in control. But this contract is built on avoidance, not true autonomy. Solitude becomes a fortress, but inside, the emotional hunger for safe, mutual intimacy remains unfulfilled, locked beneath layers of hyper-independence. Grief disguised as strength. Society often applauds this form of self-sufficiency as strong or empowered, particularly for women who have been culturally conditioned to sacrifice themselves in relationships. But as Jung would say, this is the persona, the socially adaptive mask that conceals the vulnerable inner child who still longs to be emotionally held. The deeper suffering is not the absence of a partner, but the absence of felt safety in connection itself. Symbolic image, the exiled queen. Imagine the exiled queen, once seated in the court of intimate belonging, now ruling from a distant tower she herself constructed. Her crown remains, but the throne room is empty. The walls protect her from further betrayal, but they also prevent the nourishment of true connection. This is the paradox of chosen solitude: safety without intimacy, control without nourishment, autonomy without belonging. The solitude that many women adopt is often not solely their own. It is an inheritance, a silent legacy passed through generations of unprocessed pain. In Jungian terms, this is the activation of a complex, an autonomous psychic structure formed through layers of personal, familial, and cultural trauma, each generation adding threads to a web of unspoken grief. Many women who live alone are carrying the emotional debts of their mothers, grandmothers, and even great-grandmothers. Women who endured emotionally absent or abusive partners were forced into marriages as acts of survival, not love, silenced their own needs to preserve the family or avoid abandonment. What the ancestors could not process becomes the unconscious burden of the next generation, the repetition compulsion, protecting the wounded lineage. The daughter often absorbs the unspoken message, "It's safer to not depend on anyone." Emotional closeness leads to pain. To need is to be at risk. This creates a repetition compulsion, a Freudian concept, where unresolved psychic conflicts are unconsciously reenacted. But in this case, the repetition takes the form of avoidance rather than engagement. Solitude becomes a preventive defense against repeating their mother's suffering. The unconscious loyalty to the mother wound. In many cases, the solitude serves as a silent loyalty to the mother's unhealed pain. I will not let myself suffer like she did. I will break the cycle by refusing to need. Yet ironically, this avoidance perpetuates a different version of the same pain. Disconnection. Emotional. Hunger, a chronic absence of nourishing intimacy. Complexes as frozen emotional time. Jung saw complexes as splinter psyches, autonomous fragments that function independently of conscious will. The ancestral relational complex may keep the woman emotionally frozen at the developmental stage, where the original trauma occurred, often early childhood, where attachment was first fractured. Without conscious work, the woman may believe her solitude is her choice, when in fact it is a reenactment of generational wounds played out in a new form. Symbolic image. The unclaimed heirloom. Imagine an old locked chest passed down through generations. Inside are the emotional artifacts of unresolved grief, betrayal, and silent longing. Each generation carries the chest, unopened, believing its weight is simply part of life. But opening the chest, confronting the ancestral wounds, is the act of individuation that finally frees the lineage. According to Carl Jung, every woman carries within her psyche the animus, the inner masculine principle responsible for logic, structure, protection, and discernment. In its healthy form, the animus serves as an inner ally, empowering boundaries, agency, and creative action. But when a woman has been repeatedly wounded in relationships with men through betrayal, abandonment, emotional unavailability, or domination, the animus can become distorted. Instead of serving her, it becomes a tyrannical internal critic, hardened by trauma. The defense against vulnerability. For many women who choose solitude, the shadow animus operates as an unconscious protector. If you need no one can betray you. Dependence is weakness. Emotions make you unsafe. This internalized masculine voice suppresses the feminine's natural longing for relational nourishment, tenderness, and emotional openness, coding those needs as dangerous vulnerabilities rather than human essentials. The illusion of strength through domination of self. The tyrannical animus doesn't only guard against others, it turns inward, dominating the woman herself, criticizing her emotional longings as childish or foolish, shaming her desire for intimacy as evidence of weakness, forcing hyperfunctionality, control, and perfectionism. This is not empowerment. It's emotional self-colonization. The false individuation. Mistaking self-protection for self-realization. Here lies one of the most insidious illusions. Hyper-independence may feel like individuation, but in reality, it is often a sophisticated trauma adaptation. True individuation integrates both the masculine and feminine within. Strength and softness, autonomy and intimacy, sovereignty and vulnerability. The shadow Animus, however, fragments this integration by exiling the feminine's emotional voice, symbolic image, the iron throne within. Imagine the woman seated on an iron throne forged not from personal sovereignty, but from swords of past betrayals and wounds. The throne is cold, hard, and unyielding. It promises safety through dominance, but at the cost of warmth, intimacy, and emotional aliveness. She rules her inner kingdom alone, but the price of this rule is disconnection, both from others and from her own heart. At its core, prolonged solitude can become an unconscious addiction, not to isolation itself, but to the absence of emotional risk. The woman convinces herself, "If I feel nothing, nothing can hurt me. If I stay alone, I stay safe." But beneath this adaptation lies emotional self-abandonment, the chronic suppression of one's authentic emotional needs in order to prevent re-experiencing the agony of relational wounding. Trauma-driven emotional numbing. In trauma theory, this is the manifestation of dorsal vagal shutdown, a state where the nervous system, overwhelmed by relational threat, enters a freeze-like dissociative state. The woman becomes physically alive but emotionally numb, reduced affect, flattened desire for relational closeness, low-grade anxiety masked by functional independence. Peter Levine describes this as the body's attempt to play dead in response to overwhelming relational pain, self-abandonment disguised as emotional maturity. Culturally, this emotional detachment may be mistaken for maturity, wisdom, or even spiritual transcendence. I've risen above attachment. I've outgrown the need for partnership. I'm at peace being alone. But often, this is not transcendence. It's shutdown. The psyche has chosen numbness over vulnerability because the risk of re-entering emotional engagement feels existentially unsafe. The addictive loop of control addictions, at their core, are not about substances or behaviors. They are about escaping intolerable emotional states. In this case, solitude becomes the addictive substance, predictable, controllable, free of relational volatility. But like all addictions, it offers safety at the cost of aliveness. The woman survives but no longer fully lives. Symbolic image, the frozen lake. Imagine standing upon a frozen lake. The ice is thick, solid, seemingly unbreakable. Beneath it, vibrant life continues, flowing, moving, alive, but inaccessible. The woman's emotional world is like that, frozen lake. Her vibrant relational self remains trapped beneath layers of protective ice, awaiting the slow thawing of healing. One of the most seductive illusions perpetuated by both modern culture and some self-help narratives is this: you must become completely self-sufficient to be whole. For women traumatized by relational pain, this message feels comforting, as if full independence will protect them from ever being wounded again. If I never need anyone, no one can hurt me. If I can meet all my own needs, I will be invulnerable. But this is not healing. This is self-sealing armor born from relational terror. Healing is not emotional invincibility. True healing does not mean eradicating the need for others. It means restoring the nervous system's capacity to trust safe connection. Carl Jung's individuation is not a path toward radical separation, but toward conscious integration of one's wounded relational history, allowing both autonomy and interdependence to coexist. When the feminine is split from relational vulnerability, individuation remains incomplete. The trauma behind hyper-independence. At the root of hyperindependence is often disorganized attachment, a nervous system torn between craving closeness and fearing it. The psyche learns intimacy equals danger, dependence equals betrayal, trust equals potential annihilation. Thus, independence becomes a trauma response disguised as personal evolution. The relational wound requires relational repair. As Stephen Auri Porges explains through the polyvagal theory, safety is co-regulated. Our nervous systems are biologically wired to heal through safe, attuned relationships, not isolation. Without relational engagement, the nervous system remains locked in protective shutdown or chronic hypervigilance, unable to fully relax into embodied safety. Symbolic image. The fortress with no bridge picture. A fortress built high upon a cliff, fortified, isolated, impenetrable. Inside, the woman rules her domain safely, but no bridge connects her to the outside world. True healing requires the courage to build that bridge, not toward dependency, but toward healthy, conscious, reciprocal connection. Shadow work is incomplete without addressing relational wounds. Many approaches to shadow work focus exclusively on internal patterns, fears, beliefs, suppressed emotions. But for women who have adopted solitude as protection, the deepest shadows live in the relational field. Fear of being seen fully, fear of abandonment after intimacy, fear of repeating generational betrayals. These are not abstract shadows. They are living emotional wounds embedded in the nervous system, activated in proximity to others. Conscious exposure to relational triggers. Carl Jung emphasized that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In relational shadow work, this means deliberately engaging with the edges of discomfort in safe relational contexts, allowing oneself to receive care without deflecting, expressing needs without shame, sitting with the vulnerability of being emotionally seen, the nervous system as the arena of transformation. Peter Levine's somatic work shows that trauma lives not only in memory, but in the body. Relational shadow work, therefore, involves tracking bodily responses during relational interactions, recognizing when dorsal vagal shutdown or sympathetic activation is triggered, practicing grounding, breath, and self-regulation while remaining emotionally engaged. Healing occurs not through isolation, but through safe exposure and integration of previously intolerable emotional states. The paradox of safety through openness. The nervous system heals when it experiences consistency, emotional attunement, non-judgmental witnessing. This requires choosing carefully cultivated relationships where vulnerability is met with compassion, not criticism, abandonment, or control. It is not the quantity of connections that matters, but the quality of attuned, co-regulated experiences that allow the frozen emotional system to thaw. Symbolic image. The garden gate. Imagine a garden surrounded by high walls. For years, the gate remained locked, vines covering the entrance. Relational shadow work is the slow, deliberate act of unlocking that gate, not to throw it wide open to anyone, but to selectively allow those who bring safety, nourishment, and reciprocity. Individuation is not isolation, but integration. Carl Jung defines individuation as the process of becoming one's most whole, integrated self, not by rejecting aspects of the psyche, but by embracing and balancing them. For women who have lived in prolonged solitude, individuation requires confronting the false equation they've internalized. Strength, never needing anyone. Power, complete control over one's emotions. Healing, being entirely self-sufficient. But the truth is far more nuanced. Authentic feminine strength includes the capacity to surrender, not as submission, but as trust. The wounded feminine and the exile of receptivity. Many women carry a wounded feminine that equates openness with danger because being open led to betrayal, being receptive led to exploitation, trust led to abandonment. In defense, they unconsciously masculinize their energy, overfunctioning, controlling, emotionally detaching. Yet the essence of the feminine is not erased, only exiled. It longs for receptivity, softness, and safe mutuality, but has no map for how to reclaim it without risking annihilation again. True surrender requires internal safety first. Surrender is only possible when the nervous system is regulated. The relational environment feels safe. Boundaries are intact, but not defensive. As Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory explains, ventral vagal activation allows one to experience openness while remaining grounded. The biological state of safe connection. Without this internal safety, surrender feels like a free fall. With it, surrender becomes a conscious choice, not a collapse. The strength of feminine interdependence. Feminine individuation invites a profound paradox: strength in softness, power in vulnerability, safety in openness. This is not a return to dependency, but an evolution into secure relational capacity, where one can give and receive love without losing oneself. Symbolic image: the willow tree. The willow bends with the wind but does not break. Its strength lies not in rigid resistance, but in its flexible surrender to life's movement. So too with the individuated feminine, able to open, to bend, to trust, while deeply rooted in self. The hermit. Necessary solitude, but temporary exile. In Jungian psychology, the hermit archetype represents the phase of withdrawal, stepping back from relational entanglements to engage in deep inner work, reflection, and healing. For many, women who have chosen solitude after relational trauma, this hermit phase feels necessary, a place of safety, a pause from emotional volatility, a time to rebuild identity. But the danger lies in remaining indefinitely within the hermit's cave, mistaking temporary protection for permanent refuge. The garden, the relational field of conscious living. While the hermit serves a function, individuation ultimately calls for re-engagement with the garden, the domain of emotional nourishment, intimacy, reciprocal vulnerability, co-created meaning. The garden symbolizes relational wholeness, where one no longer enters relationships out of emptiness or compulsion, but from a grounded, sovereign center. The bridge between the hermit and the garden. The work of individuation is not the rejection of either state, but the conscious movement between them. The hermit provides integration of shadow and self. The garden offers embodiment of relational wholeness. Neither extreme alone leads to healing. Integration allows the woman to carry her solitude into the garden, not as armor, but as wisdom. The false choice between isolation or enmeshment. Many trauma survivors believe they must choose total independence to avoid pain, total enmeshment to avoid loneliness. But individuation reveals a third path: conscious interdependence, where selfhood is preserved and connection is welcomed. Symbolic image: the garden gate. Revisited, returning to the earlier image. The woman, once behind locked gates, now opens them by choice, not because she needs rescuing, but because she has cultivated internal safety. She steps into the garden, not to fill a void, but to share her aliveness. This is the ultimate secret Jung points to. Individuation is the art of remaining fully oneself, while fully connected to life, the core wound beneath chosen solitude. As Gabor Mate profoundly observes, The essence of trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you as a result. For many women who live alone, the true trauma is not simply abandonment or betrayal. It is the internal collapse of safety and connection. The solitude is not chosen from empowerment, but from an unconscious protective response to developmental wounds, emotional neglect, lack of attuned caregivers, early betrayal of trust, chronic unmet relational needs. The body keeps the score. The physiology of isolation. Bessel van der Kolk's work reveals how trauma becomes imprinted in the nervous system, leading to dissociation, freeze response, hypervigilance, emotional numbing. Emotional isolation becomes not only psychological but deeply neurophysiological, a system wired for protection, not intimacy. The paradox of safety. In solitude, the woman's nervous system may feel safe because there is no relational unpredictability, no risk of emotional abandonment, no triggers of past betrayal. But this safety is static, a state of suspended aliveness, where the cost of safety is disconnection from relational nourishment. The path forward: relational nervous system healing. True healing requires co-regulation, experiencing safe, attuned relational interactions, somatic awareness, learning to track bodily states during emotional engagement, gradual exposure, allowing the nervous system to tolerate increasing levels of vulnerability, compassionate witnessing, being emotionally seen without judgment, or re-traumatization. As Stephen Porges explains, ventral vagal activation is the biological state that makes safe connection possible. Healing is not about eliminating vulnerability, but expanding the system's capacity to hold it. Individuation as embodied wholeness. The individuation journey, then, is not the renunciation of relationships, but the healing of the structures that once made relationships unsafe. To surrender without collapse, to love without losing self, to receive without terror. This is where solitude transforms into sovereignty. Not a fortress of exile, but a garden of conscious, regulated, reciprocal belonging. Encerramento reflexivo e prática meditativa. Before we close, allow yourself a moment of gentle reflection. Close your eyes. Picture the garden gate within your soul. For so long it remained locked, vines covering its entrance. But now, gently, you place your hand upon the gate. You are not forcing it open. You are listening to your body, your heart, your nervous system. You breathe. And as you do, the gate responds, not with urgency, but with readiness. Not because you need rescuing, but because you are ready to step into life with wholeness. You are not broken. You are becoming.